Just a heads up, this episode is written by John Livingston. You can find more of his writings over at The Troubles Archive on Instagram, where he writes about a multitude of things related to the Troubles in Northern Ireland. A battered body lying on the living room floor, a crossbow bolt in the wall, drugs, women, raves, jealousy, a string of dead Catholics, communities living in fear, deadly feuds, and dangerous rivals all around. This was the life of Stephen Top Gun McKeag. RUC detectives stood over the 30-year-old's body in his home, and many were shocked. Here was a man who was idolised by his community, a man that struck fear into his enemies, even the police. He was a man that, according to one of his fellow loyalists, quote, had a dead-eyed, tranquil face. He was a young man who showed, quote, no hesitation in doing anything and breezed through the most heartless of assassinations. As police removed his body from his home, many began to wonder what had happened. How did it come to this? Had he been murdered by the UVF? It certainly was plausible given that there was a violent feud erupting on the Shankill between the UVF and the UDA. Or was he killed by Republicans, after years of targeting Catholic civilians? To know the answer to this question, we have to go back to the beginning. This is The Troubles Podcast, a podcast which explores the violence and bloodshed that occurred in Northern Ireland, the Republic of Ireland, and Great Britain, as multiple sides and organisations waged a bloody conflict over the status of Northern Ireland. Stephen McKeag was born in 1970. He was poor, with not much of an education to his name. He grew up surrounded by those who would become synonymous with the world of loyalism, including Mark Swinger Fulton, Johnny Adair, Sam McCrory, Torrens Knight and Billy Wright. Many of this generation were uneducated, out of work, with little prospects for a prosperous future. Some later studies have shown that among working class Protestants there was a real lack of emphasis on education, and due to the changing nature of the state and lack thereof of manual work, such as in the shipyards, there was a real sense of frustration and lack of opportunity. But for some there lay a path on which many young men wanted to make their names, and that was in the world of loyalist paramilitaries. Many by the early 1980s had come to carry a sense of grievance that was typical of the working class loyalist psyche, a sense of betrayal, of being left in the dark. As more and more loyalists and Protestants were killed by IRA bombs and gun attacks, they didn't believe that the RUC and British Army were doing enough to protect them. Yet many loyalists, now as they came into adulthood in the late 70s and early 80s, wanted their time and wanted a part of the action. McKeag was soft-spoken, tranquil, and not one for the loudmouth boastfulness that was to become typical of some of the loyalists of the 80s and 90s. He was tall, shaven-headed, and very muscular. Some sources close to McKeag have stated that by the time he was in his 20s, he had led an unusually full life. He had been married and had spent years as a man of God, according to his ex-wife Alison, who was the mother of 2 of his children. McKeag considered himself a religious man, a man of God, and although not a regular churchgoer, he knew his commandments and scripture off by heart. Speaking to journalists, one of McKeag's former friends said of him, quote, he felt like it was time to be a soldier in his community's war. There were 2 things that were now to define his life. The first would be his joining up of the UDA's C Company, who took part in a large amount of sectarian killings. The second would be an individual who would have a huge influence on the life of McKeag, and that would be the mad dog of Shankill, Johnny Adair. Stephen Top Gun McKeag was now about to cross the Rubicon, from a young, faceless name on the block to one of the UDA's most infamous gunmen. Before we go any further, it's important to get a clear understanding of the Troubles at this point, and also the trajectory of the UDA in the early 90s. By 1990, the UDA was feeling like it was adrift. They had lost a powerful leader with the death of Big John McMichaels 5 years before. Then there was the shameful episode of Jim Craig's double dealing with the Provisional IRA and the INLA, which led to him being killed in a hail of loyalist bullets. Their enemies, Sinn Féin, were gaining solid ground as a legitimate political force, while the UDA was feeling shunned. This feeling was then compounded with the problem of criminality within the UDA ranks, appropriation and embezzlement of paramilitaries' resources, infighting, and the most shameful of all, espionage. and by 1990 there was a feeling of terminal decline. However, as the old proverb goes, crisis can be a moment for opportunity, and these setbacks and jailings of prominent UDA commanders after the Stevens inquiry would make room for a whole new type of loyalist. The UDA by 1992 had run into some issues. McMichaels was dead, there was a loss of weapons due to the RUC's mass seizure of guns in 1987, and as well as that, a number of prominent loyalists such as Eric McKee, William Winky Dodds and Eric Kincaid were jailed. But in a way, these events and the imprisonments allowed the UDA to break off with dead wood, and in the words of one source, quote, "The UDA really got their house in order." This meant that they had done a complete reshuffle and reorganisation of their group. They even sardonically claimed that they were grateful to John Stevens, whose inquiry had helped them remove subpar loyalists who'd been in the hidden employ of security services. Now, according to this paper, there was a new type of loyalist in town, one that would be a real line of defence against the IRA. This was a group that was going to be the driving force to show the power of loyalism. The warning, it seems, was not dismissed as typical loyalist rhetoric or bravado. Many within the high ranks of the RUC were sober in their analysis of this rhetoric. Some went as far to say that they were scared, as one RUC chief inspector stated to author Ian Wood during the UDA reshuffle, quote, "We've got a problem now, no question of it. These are a new bunch of boys in there, who are capable of anything. They scare me. Even the thought of them, but they have discipline too. They've been ready to learn the lesson from the provos. We are all in a different ballgame now." This warning was simply one voice amidst the chorus of ominous rhetoric that was coming out of Northern Ireland. This new organisation of the UDA was headed by a young Johnny Adair, with Steve Top Gun McKeag as his right-hand man. Before we go into the hits associated with McKeag, it's important to understand why the hits were happening, particularly at such a ferocious pace. These killings, though horrific, were part of a greater trajectory for the UDA. In 1992, the UDA had cleaned its own house and felt a second wind begin, and they wanted to take the war to the Pan-Nationalist Front. The Pan-Nationalist Front, or PNF, was in the mind of the Loyalists a legitimate target of anything and anyone who inadvertently aided republicanism or anything that could bring about a united Ireland. The range of people targeted was vast, and anyone could be targeted, including people who handed out Sinn Féin pamphlets, GAA coaches, SDLP members, and even in one tragic case, an Irish language teacher. The UDA was going to put into action Gusty Spence's words years earlier that any taig will do. Taig is a derogatory term for an Irish person. It's important to be aware that the Provisional IRA also did something like this throughout the Troubles, and targeted those who worked with the British Army. I've covered this in an earlier season, in an episode called The Proxy Bomb Campaign of the IRA. In the minds of many in the UDA, these actions, although unpleasant, were not irrational. This was all intended to harm what many have called the underbelly of republicanism, and it would bring the North to the abyss of civil war. Thus, in early January 1992, the UDA ignored the pleas of moderate loyalists and Protestant clergymen who begged them to adhere to the IRA December ceasefire of 1991 and went full steam ahead. One of the first victims that year was Philip Campbell, a Catholic caterer who was working in his fast food van, which was located by the Mora roundabout. A UDA man snuck up to the van and raised a gun, firing several shots, hitting Campbell. He died an hour later in the hospital. Ominously, the UDA after the shooting gave none of the predictable justification of him being an IRA man. They said nothing. They killed him because he was a Catholic and he was an easy target. However, the enemy of the UDA, the Provisional IRA, were not sitting idle. On the 17th of January 1992, 14 construction workers left work at Lisanelli British Army Base in Omagh. These men were employed by Carl Construction Company based in Antrim. They were travelling east in a large Ford Transit van, heading towards Cookstown, when just after 5 p.m. the van came to a crossroad in rural T-Bane. It was then that the Provisional IRA men of the East Tyrone Brigade detonated a 650-kilogram bomb via a command wire. The explosion in the open space was immense, and it is reported that the blast was heard as far as 10 miles away. The blast rippled up through the van, killing one row of workers instantly and sending one half of the van hurtling in the air. The cleanup operation took days, as appendages and limbs continued to be found. 8 of the passengers had been killed. There was a significant degree of outrage after this attack, with the East Tyrone Brigade releasing a statement saying, quote, "The IRA reiterates its long-standing call to those who continue to provide services or materials to forces of occupation to desist immediately. We in the IRA will not tolerate a situation where military personnel are freed from essential services where they can carry out wholesale repression of our community." This hard-faced justification of the bombing incensed the Loyalist community, and many that had been peripheral within the world of Loyalism now wanted revenge, and over the next few weeks, the Loyalists struck back on several different fronts. The first attack was carried out by the Lisburn unit of the UDA. On the 30th of January, Paul Moran was walking out of a newsagent's. He was a 33-year-old Catholic man married with a 16-month-old baby, when a single lone gunman killed him. Again, the RUC believed Moran was killed simply because he was an easy target. The next day, the UDA stated that Moran was a member of the IRA, which was instantly rubbished by the RUC, who claimed that he was a quiet, law-abiding person and had never once appeared on their radar. 48 hours after Moran's death, the UDA struck again. And this would be considered the C Company's first victim of 1992. Paddy Clark was a Catholic taxi driver based in Belfast, which was enough for him to be deemed a target by Loyalists. On February the 2nd, 1992, Loyalist gunmen arrived at his home and tried to burst through his front door. A struggle ensued, and he managed to keep the gunmen out, but was shot several times and killed in his hallway. Tragically, 8 weeks before his death, Paddy had told one journalist who was visiting the city in late December of 91, quote, "Driving a taxi is a job, not a crime, and I'm an Irishman, and if the Loyalists look at me as a target, there's nothing I can do. They know where to find me." Later, the UDA claimed he was targeted because of his affiliation with the Falls Road Taxi Association, and he was the 7th taxi driver thus far to be killed. In the eyes of some Loyalists, the taxis were an integral feature of the IRA's war effort. Paddy Clark had been a well-known member of the Gaelic League and an Irish language activist. This highlighted that the UDA and its war on the PNF believed that the scope for legitimate targets was indeed wide. But there may be more to it, and there may have been a slightly different reason for Clark's murder. The following account is from David Lister and Hugh Jordan's book, Mad Dog. According to one UDA source who uses the false name John, Paddy Clark's fate was sealed when a neighbour of his, a Catholic woman, went to the UDA headquarters on the Shankill, saying that she would like to meet Johnny Adair. Adair agreed to meet the woman at the UDA headquarters above Frizzell's fish shop, which would later go on to be bombed in the Shankill bombing. John says in the book that the woman arrived and charmed Adair, telling him that she suspected her neighbour was in the IRA. They then drove to the Belfast Zoo, where she performed a sex act on Adair. This, according to David Lister and Mad Dog, sealed Paddy Clark's fate, which was an example that anyone's life could be taken away if they said or did the wrong thing, or if they just happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. But the horror wasn't over, not by a long shot. It was during this period, between the T-Bane atrocity and March of that year, Stephen Top Gun McKeag decided he wanted in on what many people would call ruthless murder, but what he and his associates would call the action. According to one C Company member going by the pseudonym Pete, he explained that many of the UDA men were, quote, looking to get their hands dirty. It was going that there was always others wanting to do a bit, but it was just getting too much. Every fucking day you had a new face and there was always someone with them from before. The sentiment was crystal clear that in the early weeks of January 1992, the UDA were not short of volunteers. However, their next cause for celebration would come from an unlikely source. On the 4th of February, 2 days after Paddy Clark's murder, RUC officer Alan Moore walked into the Sinn Féin office on the Falls Road, pulled out a pistol and gunned down Sinn Féin members Paddy Loughran, Pat McBride and Michael O'Dwyer, before then turning the gun upon himself. This action did please some Loyalists. They themselves still needed to avenge the bombing at T-Bane, and that would come quite soon. Just a quick note to say that if you are enjoying this podcast and want to support it, you can do so over at patreon.com/The Troubles Podcast. I've been filling up the private Patreon feed for over 3 years now and have a huge amount of Patreon exclusive content for you to check out. Each episode gets its own companion video where I talk about what's happening in Northern Ireland right now, as well as some additional details that came up after the release of the episode. I also have some Patreon-only episodes, such as one all about the troubles in popular culture and the songs that came out of that period. And just last week, I released a Patreon-exclusive interview with Kevin Owens, who was in the Irish Army patrolling the Irish border in the 90s, and he had some very interesting stories to tell. If you have been enjoying this podcast over the last few seasons and would like to help me turn this into a full-time job, you can do so over at patreon.com/The Troubles Podcast. Thank you. On the 5th of February 1992, there was a hive of activity in the Sean Graham bookmakers. It was just after lunch, and the bookies was full of people betting on horses and football matches. Two men stepped in through the doors of the bookies. They were both masked and dressed in boiler suits. One was carrying an AK-47 and the other a 9mm handgun. The men opened fire on the people in the bookies, discharging 45 rounds into the room. They then turned to walk out of the shop, but one hesitated in the doorway and turned around, shouting into the shop, "Remember T-Bane." As residents, ambulance workers and a local priest made their way to the doorway of the bookies, the sight that greeted them could only be described as a charnel house. A charnel house is a room full of skeletons. There were bullet-strewn bodies laying across the floor. Blood was splattered across the walls, and the only sounds to be heard were the screams and groans of the injured and dying. As one journalist recounted, the sounds of the wounded were drowned out by the screams of a commentator of a horse race that was playing on the TVs. 5 people were killed in this attack. 3 at the scene, Peter McGee, Christy Doherty and Jack Duffin, and 2 died at the hospital. 54-year-old Willie McManus. 15-year-old James Kennedy was mortally wounded and was loaded into an ambulance to be brought to the hospital. In the ambulance, he was comforted by a friend, and James managed to tell him, quote, "Tell my mummy I love her." He passed away in the hospital. 2 years later, his mother Kathleen passed away after a brief illness, in what her husband and family believe was a broken heart. Her husband, James Sr., is quoted as saying, "The bullets that killed James didn't just travel in distance, they travelled in time. Some of those bullets never stopped travelling." There was a wave of revulsion in the wake of this attack. The UDA issued a statement claiming that the lower Ormeo Road was a hotbed of Republican activity. In a show of support, the families of the victims of the T-Bane attack grieved alongside the families of those killed in the Sean Grahams. The widow of the teenage victim killed in T-Bane, Oswald Gilchrist, Betty Gilchrist, wrote a letter of condolences to be read out at Jack Duffin's funeral. Meanwhile, the UDA was showing no sign of ending its campaign of violence, but the next killings would be within its ranks. First, there was the gunning down of UDA man David Boyd, whom they killed in early January 1992. And then there was the execution of Edward Ned McCreary on April 15th. And it's believed that the killings were carried out by a special assignments unit that focused on dealing with internal affairs such as corruption and collusion. So after these grudges were dealt with, it was back to business. And Stephen Top Gun McKeag was about to make his mark. On the 28th of May 1992, 26-year-old mother of 2, Philomena Hanna, was working on a window display in the pharmacy she worked at on Springfield Road. This chemist was located near an arterial route that linked the loyalist Shankill to the nationalist Springfield Road. According to her sister, she was well known by both Unionists and Nationalists alike, as a part of her job was taking medicine to those in need who couldn't travel, to get their prescriptions, and to deliver oxygen canisters. She was described as the type of person that would have done anything for anyone, especially her kids. On this day, she was standing in the window working on a shop display when, according to witnesses, a motorbike with 2 men pulled up outside the shop. Dressed in black, with a black motorcycle helmet on, one of them walked into the chemist, pulled out a pistol and fired at Philomena, who fell to the floor. One of the men then walked up to the wounded woman, stood over her and fired 5 times into her head and body. The gunmen then walked out of the shop. MacDonald and Cusack write in the book, UDA Into the Heart of Loyalist Terror, that one man was laughing and singing loudly as he jumped into the back of the motorcycle before shouting, "Follow the yellow brick road. Follow, 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 follow the yellow brick road," as they sped off. Many credible sources believe that this was McKeag's first kill. The next account comes from the same book. A source calling himself Pete said he was close to McKeag and recalled that after the killing of Philomena, there was a celebration in a local pub on the Shankill, and drinks were flowing and there was a mood of triumph amongst the men of C Company. Pete went on to say that people were astounded that this young 22-year-old had breezed through his first kill. Stephen McKeag was the new kid on the block, and many of his fellow company members were impressed that here was someone who hadn't expressed any qualms about killing a young woman and a mother of two. This was made even more clear when a UDA man asked him how he carried out the murder. McKeag laughed aloud and said, quote, "Yeah, 5 right in her fucking face." It was said that many within C Company ranks were stunned at the ease in which this young man had so easily dispatched a young woman. Pete continued, quote, "Look, everyone got sweaty palms when going out on a job, but not Stephen. He had it. He just breezed through it." After Philomena Hanna's murder, the UDA gave a terse response, saying that she was the sister of a high-up Sinn Féin member, a press officer to be exact. This hit, they claimed, was the result of high-grade intelligence. This high-grade intelligence was nothing more than unsubstantiated gossip, which had somehow placed Philomena in connection to a car bomb attack on Adair's neighbour, Jerry Drumgoole, who in 1991 was injured when a bomb detonated underneath his car. There was a spurious claim that Philomena was seen walking up and down outside Jerry's home with a pram as reconnaissance before the bomb was placed. This claim was again rubbished by the RUC and many others who claimed that it was nothing more than naked sectarianism. It also highlighted how flawed and dangerous the UDA high-grade intelligence could be. After Philomena's killing, those close to McKeag claimed that this set something off in him, and over the next 18 months, he waged a campaign of violence against the nationalist community and the PNF. By the end of the year in 1992, McKeag was growing into a very muscular and determined man, who instilled admiration into the eyes of his peers, but also fear and envy. Even the RUC was struck by how cold and intimidating he was. Whenever he was brought into interviews, often it was reported that he would just be silent and stare coldly into the eyes of the policemen with his arms folded, not saying a word. He also began to change his mannerisms and style. He wore designer clothes, muscular fitted t-shirts, a gold chain with a gun on it, an earring and a reverse baseball cap. This reinvention of McKeag was no doubt due to the fact of his growing bond with Johnny Adair. Some have claimed, when analysing the differences between loyalists and nationalists, that nationalist paramilitaries rarely allowed themselves to look flashy that would draw attention upon them. This has even led some to joke that the likes of Martin McGuinness and Gerry Adams looked like quiet geography teachers. It was not lost upon the people in their community that Top Gun idolised Adair, even to the point that he wanted to resemble him. According to Adair's girlfriend, Jackie Robinson, in the book Mad Dog, when she would go out shopping for clothes for Adair, McKeag would call her up and ask her to get him the same ones. But the real thing that impressed some loyalists about McKeag was his ability to kill without question or hesitation. After the first kill of Philomena, McKeag struck again. On the 27th of December 1992 in New Lodge, North Belfast, Gerard O'Hara had just come back from the corner shop with a pack of cigarettes and some sweets, and had settled down for a quiet night watching TV with his mother. Unbeknownst to him, McKeag and another man were both masked, wearing boiler suits, and watching his home in a stolen car. They had travelled from the loyalist Tiger Bay area and were under the impression that this home was the residence of a provisional IRA man from the Belfast Brigade. Gerard was on the couch when the front door burst open and McKeag and another member of C Company came through the hallway, shouting and carrying pistols. They turned to Gerard and opened fire. He tried to flee and ran forward to shut the living room door and block the gunmen. He was somewhat successful, but the lower half of the door was made of glass. Both gunmen then fired through the glass in the bottom of the door, striking Gerard multiple times, and he fell to the floor. It was then that McKeag and the other shooter took a kneeling position and fired multiple times into Gerard's body. Gerard's mother, Bridget, was at the top of the stairs screaming and pleading for the killers to shoot her instead. It was then she claimed in Ian Wood's book Crimes of Loyalty that one of the gunmen stood up and stared at her without blinking. Then after glaring at her for a moment, turned and began firing back into her son. The killers then turned and fled. Bridget went down the stairs and cradled her son's body, who had been shot a total of 17 times. The UDA's claim that an IRA man was at this house was instantly rubbished as completely false. As of writing, the UDA maintained that the O'Hara home was a legitimate target, and they had intelligence indicating that there was an IRA man in the home that night. The authors of the book Mad Dog claim that the intelligence actually came from a CID officer who passed the information along that one of the O'Hara brothers was in the provisional IRA and was linked to the killing of a 24-year-old Scots Guardman that previous month. To the loyalists of C Company, the killing of Gerard was justified. Here's a quote from someone who claims they're a part of the killing. "I was in on that. It was a fair target. The family was involved. His brother, an active provo, had been sunning himself in the front garden half an hour before C Company moved. Then when this individual was asked how he felt about Gerard's mother trying to save her son, he said, quote, 'Listen, I'd have shot her myself. She was a provo. She was backup for them. She washed their clothes in that house after they'd been out killing my people. As for the boy, he'd have been a provo too if he had lived long enough. It was an act of war. I have no remorse over it. None. We got a target. We got a result.' Whatever the case for legitimacy of the target, nobody dared to challenge McKeag over the killing. His demeanour before and after these hits was admired by a host of already hardened loyalist men. Many at the time shared McKeag's attitude when it came to killing, that anyone will do. Quote, 'Nobody likes wasting a journey. If you can't get a target, get his brother or get the man walking down the road. We were doing what the Republicans were doing to us.' By autumn of that year, the UDA was indeed bringing the fight to the Republicans, but their violence wasn't always aimed at the Republican community. This was highlighted in the brutal murder of Donna Wilson. Donna Wilson was a mother of three who would have been considered a vulnerable adult. She was an alcoholic whose children had been taken away from her and put into social services. She had been living in the Annandale flats for the past 6 months, and during her time there, her neighbours grew increasingly frustrated by her constant blasting of dance music and having people over causing loud noises with their shouting and screaming. So on the 4th of November 1992, while Donna Wilson and 3 other men were drinking and playing music, her neighbours decided they had had enough. They went to the local UDA man, Joe Bratty. We will never know what the locals might have believed was going to happen by them reporting her to him. Perhaps they thought he would have a word with her or rough her up, but what happened next surprised everyone. It was around midnight when Bratty and his gang burst into Donna's apartment, masked and carrying baseball bats. Donna and her friends were savagely beaten by the men. Cusack and MacDonald then write that Donna was surrounded and then bludgeoned to death. What happened to Donna is significant for 2 reasons. For one, it illustrated the inherent dangers of paramilitary-run communities. These paramilitaries could become cannibalistic and readily eat their own as easily as their enemies. Second, it's important to remember just how violent Northern Ireland was at this period, and it seemed that the violence was reaching out and touching every aspect of the society. As the year was in its final season, the Republicans continued with their attacks. They destroyed a bank with a bomb attack in Downpatrick and then launched an RPG attack at an RUC patrol in Divismore Crescent. They then detonated an enormous £500 bomb in Coleraine Centre, causing millions of pounds worth of damage and forcing people to move out of their homes. Once again, the deadly game of tit-for-tat had begun, and once again the ordinary people, both Protestant and Catholic, would suffer. And it was Stephen Top Gun McKeag who was going to be at the forefront of whatever C Company was going to do. It's November 4th, 1992, in James Murray's betting shop, which was on Old Park Road in a predominantly Catholic area of North Belfast. The Cheltenham horse race was on, and the place was filled with working men, both Catholic and Protestant, who were engrossed in the race. A red Ford was parked next to the building, and witnesses described seeing 2 men laughing in the car before they got out. One of the men was described as red-haired, shaven and muscular, who the author, at this point of writing, can assert beyond all reasonable doubt, was Stephen McKeag. He, along with his fellow assassin, both pulled out their V758 Czech automatic rifles, put their masks on, and then kicked open the doors of the betting shop. According to witnesses, the other gunman shouted at the people inside, quote, "You deserve this, you Fenian bastards." To which then the gunmen unleashed a barrage of gunfire on all the people inside. 62-year-old Francis Burns was struck with 4 rounds and died instantly. 50-year-old Peter Orderly was struck down with 3 bullets and subsequently killed when the second gunman threw a Soviet grenade, which exploded in the centre of the room. The third and final victim was 72-year-old John Lovett. who had been urging everyone to remain calm while the violence was unfolding around him. He was struck in the chest by a round and died the next day in the hospital. McKeag and the other gunman then ran back to the car and drove away. This was yet another tragedy that was greeted with yet more revulsion across all patches of the community. In an ironic twist of fate, 72-year-old John Lovett, who was killed in the attack, was a Protestant who had survived Japanese prisoner of war camps, only to be killed by men who claimed they were Protestant defenders. This bitter irony was not lost upon his sister, who said, quote, "Here was a man who had served Britain, suffered terribly for it, and look what happens." The getaway car was abandoned and the two men destroyed their clothes and stashed their weapons. They then went to a safe house and washed traces of gunpowder and blood splatter from their skin. The night's work had been done, and Hughes and Lister write in Mad Dog that there was an audible cheer from the Loyalist families on the peace line, who were clapping as ambulances raced to the scene. After this attack, there would be consequences. A year later, the Provisional IRA aimed their revenge at Noel Truesdale, a UDA commander who allegedly was the orchestrator of the Booking Shop massacre. He was killed after being riddled with bullets by two Provisional IRA gunmen. For the men of C Company, there was an air of celebration, and many members went to a local bar that was filled to the rafters with UDA men and C Company members. As the night progressed, many took to drinking and celebrating. Everyone except McKeag. According to many of his friends and family, it wasn't his style. One close friend, going by the pseudonym Pete, claimed, quote, "Steve just wasn't that kind of person. He used to say to me, look, I went out, I pulled a trigger, then I went home. I was just doing a job. I don't go screaming about it like others." This friend, Pete, claimed that McKeag did not relish murder, but did these actions because in his mind it was his duty. Pete went on to say that McKeag saw himself as a soldier in a war, and that he was taking the war to the enemy. Some friends of McKeag have claimed that he was a nice guy who wasn't a bully, never had an ego, and never threw his weight around. He did his job and then he went home. There was one account of UDA commander Jim Gray in 1993 handing McKeag a bag of cocaine, which he promptly went and threw down a toilet. This attitude was to change, but we'll come to that later. The RUC saw McKeag as a dangerous and significant player, with one detective putting it bluntly saying, quote, "He was probably the most evil person I've ever come across, and I've interviewed some major INLA and Provo heavyweights in my time. This guy would rank up there amongst them. He would just sit there and stare right through you." By the winter of 1992, the UDA were in somewhat of a jovial mood, compared to their doldrums of 1990. And their war on the PNF was devastating some Republican communities. One has to understand that these violent attacks also set the stage for the ceasefire of 1994. As one UDA member said to Neil Ferguson in 2018, "Loyalist paramilitaries were killing Catholics, innocent Catholics, and I think that the Catholic community got up to Republicans and go on to IRA and said this has to stop. We drove Sinn Féin to talk." In that year, the UDA had managed a partially successful bombing campaign in the Republic of Ireland, against the city they hated most of all, Dublin. In March, a UDA unit set off an incendiary device in a fabric store on Talbot Street near Connolly Station. In August, Cleary's department store and Dunn's store were destroyed. These types of bombings were usually a skill that was utilised by their rivals, the UVF. These devices were crude and not nearly as effective as some of the devastating bombs of the IRA, but they provided a serious psychological boost for loyalists. As one member of the UDA said, quote, "These bombs were a wake-up call for the people of the Republic, that there would be a price if they tried to stick their hand in our affairs." This also had a sobering effect on the security forces, who now realised that the UDA were willing to travel into the Republic. The UDA were cheerful and ominous in their Christmas message when they directly addressed the Republic of Ireland. Quote, "Sheer luck prevented our operatives from bringing you a fiery Christmas. You will not be lucky in 1993. We will bring in the year with a bang." This brings us to the end of the first part of this episode. In the next episode, we will focus on C Company and the attacks that have been attributed to McKeag, as well as the circumstances which would eventually lead to his death. Thanks for listening, and see you next time. This episode was written by John Livingstone. Johnny has a master's degree in international relations and has been studying the Troubles for 10 years. If you want to read more of his writing, you can do so over at The Troubles Archive on Instagram.